We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Matthew Pipenburg, partner of Von Greyerz AG and also the author of Gold Matters and Rig to Fail. Matt, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
I'm great, Tom. It's always good to be back and swap thoughts with you again.
Absolutely. It's always a fast-paced, big discussion with you. And I wanted to start by getting your thoughts on why you think Europe is so set on war with Russia. You know, it seems like with Trump coming in, he wants to help negotiate for peace. And yet we see many different European leaders keep pushing for more conflict. So why do you think, what do you think that is symptomatic of?
It's a broad question with a lot of different verticals to answer it. You know, I'm preparing, I've got to do an interview tomorrow with a German-speaking platform here in Europe. And, you know, I'm going to have to talk to them about German politics from an American perspective. I'm always afraid I'm going to offend half the audience with my views because they're not American, they're not German, they're trying to be objective. But of course, we can't deny we all have certain biases. There's a lot of ways to answer that. You know, the first most obvious way, when I look at Europe, like the U.S., I've said this in an article I wrote months back about what's killing America. And I thought the fact that 5 major media companies own 99% of the media in the U.S. So the message is very politicized. To me, that's not a democratization of information. It's a monopolization of information. That's just as true in Europe. There are very big cannons where the consensus view is spit out. That consensus view is highly politicized media, highly politicized information. So the people, I'm not going to say are brainwashed, but there's a strong political and financial propaganda network. That's not exaggeration. I think that's just a fact. Europe also has the memory of World War II. This is, you know, still a generation or two away, but it's strong in their memories. There's this notion, I think still they look at Putin as looking for Lebensraum in the West, like it's a Stalin period. And it's kind of ingrained in their memory that we have to protect ourselves from the East and that we have to think about war constantly. NATO is very critical. So those are perceptions that are ingrained almost in the DNA of the culture here. The political opportunists and bankers will always exploit that. And then there's an even darker theory behind that, you know, Tom. And I was listening to Alex Kreiner, who's a Yugoslavian/Croatian who lived in Switzerland. He was talking to another European named, I think it was Glenn Dissonance. It's a really interesting, you should look at that up. It's a really interesting conversation. And he's a former hedge fund manager as well. So he looks at the world a lot of the ways that I and others do as expats with a multilingual education perspective, with a financial background, and with an historical understanding of Europe, as opposed to what the media or the latest tweet tells us it is. Mm-hmm. And also a perspective of growing up, talking to soldiers who fought in the U.S. and soldiers who fought for Germany and who fought for France and the resistance. So you get a different perspective when you've actually spent time not just reading the latest tweet or whatever the pundit du jour tells you, but when you actually understand these cultures and their collective histories. But one of the things that this guy Kreiner was talking about was very interesting. It was more about the history of banks and banking. And I've always said behind every major war is a pile of bankers, egotistical bankers. And that sounds like a cliche and a dramatic statement, but you know, what Alex was doing, he was going back all the way from ancient Greece to ancient Rome, to the Venetians, to then the Netherlands and the Dutch Empire, to the British Empire, and of course the U.S. Empire. And I'm simplifying, but basically saying behind all of these empires are banks and bankers and opportunities. And to simplify, you know, even if you look at the U.S. Empire, banks survive on credit. They thrive on credit. They profit on credit. They have to make loans. And for loans, they need collateral. And there's only so many mortgages, business loans, and car loans a bank or a system can make. And what Alex was saying, which I think is very astute, is In a more larger macro perspective, large banks and large countries, they need to constantly find new collateral to issue more lending, to make more profits. And so what they've effectively done is they've colonized Latin America, Eastern Europe, parts of Africa, not literally, but financially. So we have over 800 military bases all over the world in the U.S., for example. And what his point is, that's not for protecting freedom and democracy. That's for protecting contracts for natural resources, whether it's 12 trillion worth of natural resources in the Ukraine, whether it's in Eastern Europe, whether that's in South America. John Perkins' famous book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, make that very clear, that these banks need to keep finding collateral. They need to not necessarily go to war and colonize physically, but they can create tensions and colonize financially and always have their interests. And so there is a very strong interest in the 12 trillion worth of resources in the Ukraine. And there is a very strong interest in the heartland of Eurasia for Western powers, in particular the US, the UK, France, and Germany, to have influence there. And what he was saying, and what I totally agree with, and what Jeffrey Sachs is saying, who's been speaking in front of the European Parliament, you guys, he's saying, if you look at every international conflict since 1946, after World War II, 80% of those have been basically involving the US, whether they're instigating or protecting. And he's also saying, this is Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia, formerly at Harvard, not an elitist, but actually an intellectual who understands. He's also saying these wars aren't necessarily for freedom and democracy. They're opportunities. They're financial opportunities. Now, many proud American patriots will say that's not fair, that's wrong, and I'm going to upset them. But many combat veterans I know have said, and I'm talking post-World War II, have said, look, we don't really know what the freedom and democracy is we're spreading. We definitely see the Halliburtons and the BlackRocks and the banks making profits from these police actions or these proxy wars. And so it's a very cynical way of saying, I'm giving you a long answer to a short question. Are there profound financial motives? And Europeans, you keep asking, why do they keep wanting war? And again, you could say it's their memory, it's their collective distrust, it's their collective fears of, but even World War I and World War II, if you look at, there were massive financial motives behind those. And again, it gets very wonky. It takes more than 30 minutes to get into each of those examples. It's fascinating to see. And maybe people say it's an oversimplification, but the short answer is there are far more financial incentives and base layer incentives behind American foreign policy and now European electoral policies than just freedom and democracy and saving the Ukraine. There are some who will always think of Zelensky as George Washington 2.0, and he's just there to save democracy and freedom, and that Ukraine is this bastion for democracy and freedom. Anyone who lives in Europe knows that's not true, that Ukraine is the least example of a democratic history then or now. And everyone also knows that its rare earths and natural resources are on the minds of Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And again, Ukraine, and I don't want to get too wonky, they were very close to a peace deal in 2022 before Boris Johnson and the U.S. came in and told Zelensky basically to forget that. Because what Putin really wanted was NATO neutrality, just like the U.S. would not want missiles on the Rio Grande. We just wouldn't accept that. Anyone who is hateful of Trump or hateful of Putin and pro-Zelensky is going to think of what I'm saying as a blasphemy. They won't even look at that possibility. I'm not saying I'm 100% right, but you got to look at that possibility. We've got to stop saying West good, Putin bad. But going back to Europe and your particular question, why do they seem to want war? Why are these coalition governments band-aiding themselves together and spending more on military when they're barely able to get through a recession? And Germany is a classic example of this. And again, for many Westerners or Canadian or Americans who don't follow European politics closely or German politics, I fully understand. But I think it's a good litmus test for what's happening in Europe. Olaf Scholz was basically pushed out, and now you got Friedrich Merz. Looks like he's the next chancellor. He's already saying, well, we hear that Trump basically is pulling away from NATO or not is quite as committed to helping Zelensky, which we can get into. So we're going to come up with 500 billion of ourselves on military spending. I think Germany could use that 500 billion euros far more on infrastructure in their own economy. They're in a recession. It's very tragic and sad and typical to see Germany spending on military and going that route as opposed to focusing inland. But if you can push the narrative that Putin is looking to expand into the West militarily, then of course that makes sense. And there are very clever people. I've talked to many in Denmark and Sweden and Germany and France. There are many clever people who really do believe that, Putin's just one goose step away from heading into the West and looking for more, again, Lebensraum in the West. I strongly disagree. Jeffrey Sachs would strongly disagree. If you actually take the time to listen to what Putin has said and written, and he would strongly disagree. But then if you listen to Zelensky, he'll say Putin's a liar, nothing you can say you can't trust. Obviously very biased. So I don't pretend to have the final answer on this.
Mhm.
What I do know, and I saw Colonel Douglas McGregor in Vancouver in January, what I do know is that Ukraine has become a meat grinder for Ukrainian soldiers and citizens. And it's also a meat grinder to a lesser extent for Russian soldiers, whether they're Chechenian or otherwise. And I think when you have over 1 million deaths in what I think is a completely avoidable war, we should all be asking, is this a good idea? We should all be looking at alternative ways to look at this, regardless of whether you're left or right, European or American. And Trump is doing that. Again, it's not a pro or negative Trump thing. It's just he sees the writing on the wall. This is not a winnable war. Douglas McGregor said it's not a winnable war. And frankly, I was talking to another military fellow the other day. Even if you put 500 billion euros into Germany's military expansion, they wouldn't last under current and even future circumstances more than 2 or 3 days in a war against Russia, even with the alliance of the UK and France. It's in a nuclear era, the idea that politics and that war is just an extension of politics by another mean. To me, that's madness. And when you hear Mitt Romney in the U.S. talking to the Americans about we need to support this war, we need to support Zelensky, I understand the patriotic optics of supporting a democracy surrounded by the big bad wolf Putin. And I'm not pro-Putin, and I don't want to live in Russia, and I'm not anti-American. But when Mitt Romney says, hey, it's okay because no Americans are dying, we can keep supporting this. To me, that is absolutely appalling way of looking at circumstances. That it's okay to throw these sons and brothers and parents of Russian and Ukrainian families into the meat grinder while we pay for the missiles and they get picked up off the streets to fight in these trenches and these artillery barrages. It's very easy to say that's patriotic America, pro-democracy and pro-freedom, and not to worry because Americans aren't dying. Well, most Americans don't want to go fight that war. And again, if you believe that you're fighting for democracy, I can understand why that would be true. There are many indicators that nothing about Zelensky since he came into power is democratic or freedom, whether it's censorship, whether it's locking up religious dissidents, whether it's locking up political dissidents. I will say, and this is just my opinion, I'll end it on this, and it'll probably upset half your audience. This was an avoidable war. I believe Zelensky was placed there by the West as another puppet example. I believe the real motives, and many Western diplomats will admit this, is financial. It's not freedom and democracy. And it's about expanding NATO to the point where, of course, you're going to upset Putin, just like we would be very upset, again, if there were Russian or Chinese missiles on the Rio Grande or at Windsor, Toronto, pointing at the U.S. or Windsor, Ontario. So we have to be able to look at this in more than one way. And I'll end on a famous quote by Kissinger, of which I'm no fan, but he's certainly not a stupid man. He's a very realistic politician, very self-interested politician, a realpolitik. He said, it's dangerous to be an enemy of America, but it's fatal to be a friend of America. And Europe has been following U.S. foreign policy, military policy, and economic policy like a child follows its parents ever since World War II. And when Trump came in and said, well, you're gonna have to pay your fair share of the defense now. We want you to put 5% of your GDP into NATO. He knew that was an unacceptable condition for all of these countries. And what I think Trump is really saying is NATO is obsolete. NATO is an aggressive, not a defensive strategy. It's financially driven. And we are too broke as a country to keep being the world's policemen. And so he is saying NATO is not it's not going to be the same as it was. This organization of Europe is not going to be the same as it was. Jeffrey Sachs is educating the European Parliament about how naive they've been in following American policy. But we are not the America of 1990, of the end of history, of the last man, of Wolfowitz doctrine, of Cheney and these guys. We are a broke America. Trump admits it. Our debt is appalling. We have to cut spending. The war is being lost. It's too expensive. We're going to cut back. And rather than fight Putin for these resources, we may want to cooperate. Now, how's that for a revolutionary, crazy thought? Does that make me a pro-Trump MAGA crazy? No. Does that make me anti-democratic principles? No. We're realistic. And again, I go back to Kissinger. It's very fatal to be a friend of America if you follow us blindly. And what Sachs was telling the European Parliament is don't be so naive. And yet, to your original question, whether it's Friedrich Merz or other coalition governments, or gosh forbid what's happening in the UK. By the way, UK, Germany, huge financial interest in keeping the Ukraine as a gateway to rare earths and lithium and other natural resources. So they have a financial motive. Their banks have a financial motive. But the actual moral and financial reality is America can't afford it anymore. We'd be better off cooperating. Ironically, despite all the tough talk of Trump, he's being very realistic. It's a losing war. It's an expensive war. And I'd rather cooperate with Russia than fight with them, despite the tough talk. I think that's actually a laudable policy, but it's going to take time. And to your point, in the meantime, the Liberal Party will not let go of this message. It's all they have left. Save democracy, save freedom, save the Ukraine. In Bordeaux, not far where I live, right across from the Grand Hotel in the center place of the old opera, is a big Ukrainian flag. It is literally pushed down our throats that if we're really truly Democrat, liberté, égalité, fraternité, if we're true liberals of the great, order of great Renaissance thinking, of course we're going to support Zelensky. And that's been so pushed down our throats, but no one's actually asking, is this worth the death toll, the blood loss? And are we ignoring that maybe, just maybe, a lot of these interests are far more financial than they are of liberal principles of democracy. And that's a blasphemy to liberals who believe that Zelensky is George Washington. I understand that. I probably can't change their opinions. I'm far more realistic. And again, I take the view of Mearsheimer. I take the view of Sachs, this guy Alex, and I just think it's far more honest. It's far more realistic. And so, but these people, they will do anything to hold on to power. Most politicians, left or right. I'm not saying that's just a uniquely liberal thing or left thing. Like Tulsi Gabbard or RFK Jr., or even Donald Trump or Elon Musk. I was a former Democrat. They lost me. They lost me by holding on to, I think, outdated, power-hungry principles. And they're masquerading as democracy, but they're really hiding what I think is a wolf in sheep's clothing. I think they're really hiding the real interests behind these wars are financial. And they're driven by banks looking for collateral. And that collateral is the natural resources of other people's countries. And so here we are, so many conflicts since the Second World War. And here we are rattling for more war. I mean, it's naive to think that the alliance of even France, Germany, in Boris Johnson's England is going to fight and win a land war against Russia and China. I think Trump actually knows better than that.
Mm-hmm. Well,
long answer.
Matt, I think that is really the only way to explain how, why any of these conflicts and any of these leaders are pushing for more conflict is to look at the incentives behind them, whether that's propagating NATO, after basically the end of Soviet Russia, whether that is the UK, which, by all symptoms seems weak and broke and much of the West, yet is trying to display strength, as you said, kind of in this old way of thinking, in this, just continuing the way that they always have with this aggressive stance, because that's the way it has always been done, rather than seemingly taking a realistic posture on what the real situation is with Russia, with Putin, with the state of even their economy. And it really makes me, I get frustrated when we hear exactly these narratives that you mentioned about, trying to protect democracy, trying to be so black and white about, if you don't support Zelensky, you don't support democracy. It's just, it's asinine. And we need to be able to take more of a, let's say, a neutral or dispassionate stance when we're looking at any of these problems, so that we can get, let's say, a bigger view of the information, rather than just trusting blindly what is being told to us.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to be more critical thinking, more self-thinking, more informed. That doesn't mean emotional. It shouldn't even be partisan. It really should be beyond that. Believe me, there's many problems with Trump and the right that I have, and there's many problems with the left with Trudeau and your new leader that I could have. We can't just be all or nothing and hold on to one stance like it's a sacred cow. It's a blasphemy to think outside of that box. I think that's a horrible way of thinking. That's really kindergarten thinking. That'll upset a lot of people. I understand, even Patton, our famous General Patton during World War II, thought we should have joined with the Germans after they surrendered and fought the Soviets because they're evil. And certainly Stalin was no picnic. Stalin was no great man for Russia or the Soviet Union or the Ukraine or Georgia or any of those places. And you had Churchill in 1946 with Truman in the audience basically saying, Russia bad, Soviet Union bad. And you could understand why. So that created a very Cold War mentality by 1946 on. We emerged from World War II as a monopolar world with America as victorious. The Soviets were our allies. But by 1946, we were in a Cold War. And by the 50s, it was full on. And by the 1990s, when the wall came down, everyone thought, and that's when Fukuyama wrote his famous book, The End of History, The Last Man, liberal democracy and capitalism have succeeded. We can all go home now. Everything's fine. It was incredibly naive in 1990. I was in college and I thought that was naive. A generation later, we see that wasn't true. But we're acting today. There are still people in the left and the liberal parties who want war, who still think we're the America of 1990 or 1945. We're not. Militarily, we're extended like any empire beyond our means. We're broke. We are not under the Wolfowitz doctrine anymore. We cannot just walk around and dictate policy. Russia and China, whether you like them or not, and there's many reasons not to, are moving closer together, not further apart, for a lot of reasons that are based on our bad foreign policy, including weaponizing the world reserve currency just a few years ago. And I think Trump is a very different man in this administration than he was in his last administration. I think his advisors are giving him more blunt advice, and he's got nothing to lose now. He's not looking for a re-election. He's looking to make a difference. Again, people think that's me being pro-Trump and pom-pomming Trump. There's a lot of problems with Trump that I have, but I think he's being more realistic. And if he's seeking peace, I don't know why we have to mock that. But again, there are many who still believe that this is the America of 1945 or 1990. It's not. We're spread out too thin. We have nearly 37 trillion in public debt, well over 100 trillion in combined public, household, and corporate debt. Our deficit to GDP makes growth mathematically impossible. Our debt to GDP, our deficits to our markets are inflated. Our U.S. dollar is being balkanized in a sense where the BRICS and other countries are moving away from it, not replacing it, moving away from it. Our U.S. Treasury is no longer the only tier one asset. All this is late stage empire math. It's just basic history. And in the past, when there was not the end of America or the end of the Dutch power or the end of the British Empire, but a change. In the past, there was always associated that change with messiness and with war. Trump is basically saying the quiet part out loud, we're broke. We're not going to keep going into this meat grinder. We're not going to keep sending money into a losing war. We're not going to make NATO the sacred cow that it was for the last generation or two. This is not the same world. And he's actually looking to even speak with the Ukraine and Russia at the same table. That to me isn't stupid. That's intelligent. We have to at least be looking at these options. And to say that by itself is proof that you're a fascist, right-wing, power-hungry, whatever, for looking at these options kills the discussion right away. And in Europe, at a Stammtisch or a German conversation, if you even talk about AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, or the more extreme right, they call it, anything that's critical of immigration policy or considering working with Putin, that's considered, well, that's extreme right fascist thinking. So you self-censor and there's no dialogue. It ends. And that's certainly true in the U.S. If you were pro-Trump at the wrong dinner party, you were done. The conversation was over. Families are divided over this. Again, I'm not saying Trump is Santa Claus and has all the answers. And I'm not saying Putin is a Boy Scout and that Zelensky's a criminal. But I'm saying it's far more nuanced than that. And we got to have these discussions. We got to look at these options. We got to be far more honest about our base layer motives as a country for the last 2 generations since the war, where all our wars really about freedom and democracy. Again, walk through Syria, walk through Iraq, talk to people. Here in Europe, you get a chance to talk to a lot more of those type of people everywhere in the major cities. You can talk to Ukrainians and Russians. You can talk to Iraqis, Syrian refugees. Far more than people realize. It's not nearly as black and white as the press would make you have things believe. Nothing is. But there is a paucity of real informed thinking mathematically and historically in every country, and in particular in the liberal West. They just still want to see it black and white. Russia bad, we're good. Democracy good, we support democracy. Anything else means you're out of touch. But it's hard to have a dialogue even at a dinner table. Imagine how hard it is for politicians to give up power. And your most recent prime minister, who's just another Davos stooge and central banker who thinks of the world in terms of power and that key core driver of finding collateral, globalization, using quote unquote peaceful allies just to take advantage of their natural resources and put them under what John Perkins called these economic hitmen just to make money for bankers. I'll say it over and over. Many, many generations of young men and women have died for bankers and old gray-haired politicians. They don't send themselves to these front lines. They send their kids or other people's kids mostly. The middle class gets crushed by every market crisis, and they get crushed by every war. They're the first to be drafted or the first to volunteer because they have no other options. And again, I'll say it over and over. My whole family and most of my closest friends are all veterans. So I don't have anything against brave, courageous soldiers. But most of them, I'll say it over, are just lions led by donkeys. That's true from Verdun to the Ukraine right now. That's just my strong view. It's just my opinion. Many people will disagree with me, but that's okay. I'll say what I think. And it all comes back to markets and to gold and to currencies. So when people say, I don't need a gold bug's geopolitical views, I understand that, but we can't ignore geopolitics and geoeconomics because they do affect our markets. They do affect our currencies. So we can't ignore it. The problem is we just can't have a normal dialogue without upsetting half the audience or the person across the table if you have a different view.
Yeah.
Which is too bad.
I also find it interesting that this, let's say this liberal or what used to be considered liberal attitude of peace has now completely shifted. And it's like they've completely swapped and they're now the warmongers, which is, just a really odd stance. But if you continue that narrative and you couch it the right way, you can justify it any which way you'd like, right?
It's so different. It's so crazy in my lifetime seeing the shift, and even when you look at Trump, he's a billionaire who speaks to the forgotten working poor middle class more than the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. He's talking about reshoring jobs. In 2001, we made the America dream. It's now made in China. We offshored all our labor for C-suites and the Wall Street crowd. So the CEOs and big companies, whether it was Apple or whether it was John Deere, to make their products outside of America. Yeah, that's great. You can get TVs and 10 times cheaper, but your kids can't find a job. What would you rather have, labor or a cheaper TV? And what Trump is saying is, he's saying the quiet part out loud in the last election. You guys have been forgotten by your party. You've been forgotten by your country. I want to make America great again. I want to bring the P back to GDP. I want to bring manufacturing back. That's extremely expensive. It's extremely messy. It's extremely painful, but it has to be done. Mm-hmm. And that's gonna be costly. And a lot of these tariffs really are designed to get American companies to bring their labor back to America. And yes, that's going to be inflationary. And yes, that's going to be costly. And yes, that's going to increase our debt to GDP. So he's trying to cut money at Doge and he's trying to cut money in other places, but he's trying to do something. Mm-hmm. But the irony is, like you said, in the past, you thought of the Democrats as protecting us from these wars, and you thought of the Democrats of speaking for the middle class. But now they're pushing for war, and they've been outvoted by the middle class in the U.S. And the only thing keeping Canada and the left in power, or in Germany, or in Austria, are these coalition band-aids where no one has the majority. And so the people are still not getting what they want. But again, that's history. The people very rarely get what they want. Those in power hold their power, and the bankers are always behind the scenes making money. And again, that sounds like a very simplistic cliche, but you could literally spend chapters and verse on that. It's so many examples. And it's not conspiracy dark state. That's just history 101. And the moment you realize that, it's very dark, very dark.
It is. And I think a good example of that is basically negative real rates, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. More of your purchasing power is being eroded kind of behind the scenes and smoldering without you really realizing it. Mm-hmm. And, I really think that if it was more in people's faces, like, for example, if we had to pay our income taxes every month or every paycheck outright out of our full paycheck, this would be a completely different situation that would be far more on top of people's minds. But instead, because inflation just eats away in the background, it's not nobody really has any will to try and fight it.
It's a slow frog boil, this invisible tax of inflation and negative real rates. And it's great that you brought that up, because negative real rates, and we should explain it because not everyone knows what that means. That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonky term for some, and we need to be respectful. Not everyone has time to figure out what negative real rates is, but in a very simplistic term, negative real rates is when the inflation rate is higher than the yield on your sovereign bond or the amount of money you owe. Basically, when you have inflation higher than yields in the U.S., for example, the 10-year Treasury is the sacred cow. If it's at 4% and inflation's at 10%, then you have negative 6% real rates. But negative real rates just means inflation is eating away, and it's really, really good if you're broke. It's really, really bad for lenders to have negative real rates, because if you're a creditor and you have negative real rates and you owe X percent in the next 10 years on a loan, if over the next 10 years inflation goes higher and higher, you're actually paying back less and less. It's great if you're broke, which is why sovereign countries that are broke like to have inflation higher than the yields. But here's the trick: inflation is politically embarrassing. You don't want to show that you have inflation. And I've written about this in my most recent article. So what do? You lie about inflation. You need negative real rates to inflate your way out of debt. But that's a cause for pitchforks and guillotines throughout history. If people understand that they're losing purchasing power through inflation when they can feel it, that makes them angry. And the governments don't want an angry mass. They don't want an informed mass. So what do? Like Jean-Claude Juncker says, when the information's bad, we lie. They simply don't report inflation accurately. And that's what Powell has done. I wrote about it. I call it the witch's brew of financial repression and capital controls. And the IMF even said in a white paper in 2015, if you want to get out of debt, inflate your way out of debt. Mm-hmm. It's very simple: negative real rates. But negative real rates are political suicide, so you have to lie about the inflation part. So even though we feel like things are costing us, we don't see it. It is a frog boil. It's a death to the middle class, in particular, by 1,000 cuts. It's slow and invidious, but nations have been doing this for centuries, inflating away their debt. And then misreporting inflation, so you can't really complain about it. You can't see it. We take about the official inflation rate right now around 3%, which, by the way, never got to the target 2% that Powell said was transitory. Just forget that for a second. But we know from shadow stats and even from Larry Summers that actual inflation today, using the scale we used in the 1980s, is closer to 12 to 13%. So if the yield on the 10-year is 4%, and inflation is 12%, you're losing 8% a year in the purchasing power of your currency. If you understood that, 8% per year compounds real quickly. Mm-hmm. So that $100 you put in a shoebox, or that $1,000 you put in a shoebox 5 years ago, at 8% compounding, just lost $40 of the 100 in purchase. And that is the invisible tax. That is how the governments are stealing from you. That is financial repression. And that is why the middle class in Canada and the U.S. are the working poor. And Ed Dowd, who's a kind of recovering Blacklock alumni, he had just said this the other day: if you're really, really poor, or you're an illegal asylum seeker and you're getting a handout from the government, you're surviving. If you're on the other top 10% and you're really, really wealthy, yeah, inflation sucks, but you're doing so well, you're okay. The ones that are getting crushed are in the middle. The ones that are working 2 jobs to pay rent and have enough money for anything else. And that's the part that becomes the angry mass. But they don't know that they're being killed by the invisible tax of inflation, because the government misreports the actual inflation. They have tweaked the CPI scale so many ways that they don't even see it coming. It's an open secret. It's an open lie. But very, very few people are informed, certainly by the mainstream media. What's really exciting about this generation, platforms like yours and many others, and conversations like this and many others, left or right, but are more honest, I think, are bringing this out into the open more than the 5 companies that own the 99% of the media in the U.S. So there is the good, the bad, and the ugly on the alternative media. But, I've talked to Glenn Greenwald and these others. They're making huge changes for the people to understand and think for themselves. You can disagree 100% with what I'm saying here, but think about what I'm saying and find somebody else and think about what they're saying and think and think and think. Opinions can vary, but facts are facts. Mm-hmm. And we are running negative real rates dramatically. And that is a massive form of financial repression. And the next thing you add to that witch's brew is capital controls, controlling your money, controlling where it goes. That's the slow drip of CBDC, which you and I've talked about in the past. That's as inevitable. That train's not going to stop. That's coming. You've seen it in Canada already when Trudeau locked down your truckers. Mm-hmm. Tether is just another form of CBDC that doesn't come from a central bank. It's programmable, it's trackable, it's seizable. There's all kinds of things happening that are leading us in this way. Well, negative real rates is the first killer.
And Christine Lagarde is talking about having the digital euro ready by October 25.
Exactly. And what did I say 3 years ago? It's coming. It's coming. And it'll come in the form of a crisis. They'll talk all the positive things about central bank digital currency. It's supported by a central bank. There's no fear of a run on the bank. It's highly transparent. The efficiency is so much faster, all of which is true, but they'll leave out the really ugly parts, and they won't tell you about that. That just if you hang out with the wrong people, you write the wrong article, or you say the wrong thing, we can take that from you like that. We can watch everything you do. To me, that is not democracy. That is more centralization. And as I've said again and again, whenever nations get broke, they go into a debt crisis, becomes a currency crisis, becomes an inflation crisis. The natives get restless, social unrest follows, and then you have extreme centralization from the left or the right. And what Lagarde is talking about is just another wolf in sheep's clothing, CBDC, super efficient, super safe. No, it's super programmable, super trackable, and it's killing your civil rights and your freedoms. But no one's going to, what are you going to do? What are we going to do? How are you going to do it? And the irony is, for me, as an American citizen, I keep my money in gold outside of my country. That, ironically, is true freedom, because that's not reportable. That is the alternative to these capital controls and this financial repression. And again, people say that's a gold bug argument. No, it's common sense. It's what so many sophisticated, very wealthy families and individuals have been doing for centuries, and I see it every day in Zurich. They save in gold and they spend in fiat, but they keep their gold outside in a legal firewall between them and their country, so that can't be seized or controlled. It's not reportable because it's not a bank asset, and they're not, private vaults are not banks. So you actually have more privacy in this old analog pet rock than you do in the new super technology of all things on the, digital ledger technology meme and this freedom and efficiency meme. It's all upside down. Like everything, to me, it's upside down. It's again, the more you look in these rabbit holes and understand this, and guys like Francis Hunt have talked about it, and others, and certainly Jeffrey Sachs on the geopolitical side, who's not a quack. He is a Columbia professor who worked at Harvard, who spent decades studying this, who was there when they were trying to mediate peace between Ukraine and Russia with Turkey. He's not just a quack. Listen to him. He's trying to educate the European Parliament, and they're pushing against him, because the powers behind them and the media and the interests behind them want war, and they want to make, financial colonies out of their so-called peaceful democratic brothers and sisters. They're just there to exploit capital and make loans. That's it. Sorry, that's a very dark view of the quote-unquote liberal victory of 1990 and the good, wonderful intent of the West and the liberal West and the U.S. in particular. None of our wars are for freedom and democracy. They're for Halliburton, BlackRock, and a lot of banks. And that sounds extreme.
Well, again, I think we just have to look at the symptoms or the incentives behind it, right? And
yeah.
Unfortunately, there is a segment of the population that just will not entertain that type of. Oh
no, it's ugly. It's depressing, and it makes them distrust everything that they've trusted. So you're asking someone to inverse everything they believed in, and I understand that's painful.
Everything they've been sold.
Everything, and it's hard to hear, and you want to not believe it, But again, history's messy, and facts are stubborn things, and you have to make your own decisions, but you can't just ignore these things or these arguments or these possibilities. And again, in my family, many great people went off to Vietnam. They were incredibly brave, braver than me. What were they really there for? You can't make fun of the soldiers for that. They're not all baby killers and they're just there. They're stuck there. They're sent there. They believed in their country. They believed in their cause, and they paid the fullest measure, right? So it's not, but it'd be very hard to tell one of those people, and it's very hard to hear it from people who've been there, that they were there for nothing. And again, I don't speak for all veterans, and I certainly can't, I certainly have none of the honor to say that I served like they did, but I had too many conversations with very good friends of mine who came back from these wars, whether they were in Afghanistan or Iraq, and said, I don't know why we were there. I don't think it was for freedom and democracy. And a lot of them realized that long after they got back. Does that mean they all think that way? No. But it'd be very hard for me as a Navy SEAL, a Marine, or a private in the Army to just risk my life because I believed in my country and my cause, and then have somebody tell me that I was there for nothing, for bankers or for profit and not for democracy, I'd be angry too. I wouldn't want to see that. I wouldn't want to hear that. And who is some hedge fund guy in Zurich to tell me what America is about or Canada is about? I fought for my country. Shut up. And I don't blame them for thinking that way. But the irony is, the best soldiers, the best patriots, as our Declaration of Independence said, and even whether you're fighting for the North or the South in the Civil War, they believed they were fighting for something. They believed. And our Declaration of Independence says you fight against corruption. You fight against things that tread on your freedom. And the irony is, we're treading on the freedom of other countries to exploit resources. So or at least that's my view. And so you have to ask that before you just salute and sign up for things that aren't good for you. And yet many people don't have the choice. And I think that's tragic. And again, very strong opinion. It shouldn't be left or right. It should be fairness and honesty and at least open debate. And that's what I love about having people like Tulsi Gabbard and these others in power now. These are radical changes in perspective. Tulsi Gabbard was a soldier. She's a patriot. She's not a coward, but she's questioning these wars. Is she anti-American? Is it just because she's with Trump, you're not going to listen to her? I mean, again, this kind of thinking isn't helping us as a nation or any nation. It isn't helping us with our foreign policy. And I think NATO is outdated as a rotary dial telephone, and yet we can't talk about that. So, that's what Tony Ute from NYU said years before his death, years ago, tragically, that when this politically correct movement or this propaganda movement, it forces self-censorship, it ends open debate. I am not asking anyone to take my view on anything. I am saying we should be able to talk about this without insulting each other or claiming one as a communist and the other as a Nazi. I mean, if that's the best we got, two extremes, we're getting nowhere.
Matt, I want to go back to talking about the bond market and about rates. Yellen over the last couple of years issued far more short-term debt than what the Treasury would typically do. So what did that accomplish? And is that, in a way, a stealth form of yield curve control?
Well, yeah. I mean, the Yellen playbook of issuing from the short end of the yield curve to, take some of the pressure off the long end of the yield curve. It was a Band-Aid solution. It is a kind of a form of yield curve control in an indirect way. And, the playbook is pretty pathetic for the U.S. right now. We don't have many options. We could try the Yellen option of issuing more short duration, but that rolls over really quickly, and we don't have a lot of buyers at the Treasury auction. And more importantly, it's a guppy solution to a whale of a problem. Because when our military spending, our entitlements, and our interest on debt is 140% of our tax receipts, issuing from the short end of the yield curve is not going to solve that problem. So that's not really a good option. The other option is we could default, but that's not going to happen. As long as you have a money printer at a central bank, you're not going to default. Certainly the U.S. is not going to default. We can't do the Yellen playbook, just issuing from the short end. We can revalue gold and get $800 billion out of that. We mark $42 certificates to market value, but that's not going to solve the debt problem either. Even Doge isn't going to offset the debt problem. What are our options? They're as old as history itself. Debase your currency, inflate your way out of debt, negative real rates, financial repression. So your questions all come back to the same answer. But yeah, the short end of the yield curve, issuing short duration treasuries, is not going to solve our TGA account. It's not going to solve our government bond crisis. And it's not going to solve the fact that a lot of these trillions of dollars worth of bonds are rolling over, and there's less and less buyers at those treasury auctions, and more countries trading outside of the US dollar or net settling in gold instead of US treasuries. That's not a gold bug case, folks. Let's get past that. That is just history happening as we speak. So the treasury market, the bond market in the U.S. in particular, because it's the home of the world reserve currency and the sacred 10-year U.S. Treasury, which is the only other tier one asset by the Bank of International Settlements, that is not the same bond market that it was 10 years ago. And that treasury market is everything. If you understand how important it is, the Fed's mandate is not unemployment and inflation. The Fed's mandate is to make sure something or someone buys our U.S. treasuries, because we live on credit, we live on debt. And what's happened since 2022 and the war in Ukraine and the weaponization of the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. dollar is that more and more countries are reacting against that. They're moving away. The hockey puck is going away from the U.S. dollar. Again, it doesn't mean the ruble or the yuan is the world reserve currency and the dollar disappears. It just means a repricing of the dollar. Things are changing. The dollar is not what it was in 1990. America is not what it was in 1990. Geopolitics are not what they were in 1990 because all of these nations are collectively broke. And all of these nations are looking for different life preservers outside of the US dollar. Gold is one of them. Investors are looking at different life preservers besides the US Treasury or the US stock market. Gold is one of them. This is just open and obvious to those who are paying attention. It should not be a gold bug case or an anti-American or anti-European case. It's just history. Mm-hmm. And I think we'd be far better off, as Ed Dowd said, if you want to see if Trump's really successful in reshoring jobs and bringing productivity back and cutting war costs, we have to have a recession. That means we're actually admitting that we need the austerity and the spending cuts and the hard conversations that a normal family or business would have if they were over their skis in debt. We have to have moments of pain. We have to have what Schumpeter of the Austrian school called constructive destruction. But we postponed it for so many years that now by postponing it, we're only going to make that constructive destruction that much more painful. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Trump is even conscious of this, but I think he is thinking further than just another election cycle. And he's even said, ironically today, as the markets are tanking, could be different tomorrow. As of March 11th, the markets have seen a lot of pain the last few days. But he's even saying, we got to think beyond just the stock market. That was unheard of in the last Trump administration, when every tweet was about the stock market. Is he just a politician making excuses? Possibly. Those who hate Trump would say so. But I think he's a different man. I think he's different. I think his advisors are different. So,
and to that point, to contrast Yellen with the new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, he has admitted as well that there is going to be some pain to adjust to this new outlook. And also that Wall Street is going to suffer somewhat.
Yeah. I know there's a great quote by Nassim Taleb that the opposite of success isn't failure, it's name dropping. I know a lot of people who know Scott Bessent. I've seen him, and he's refreshingly smart. Compared to Yellen, I'll take him all day long. He's also a big gold investor, but that's neither here nor there. But he understands history, he understands gold, he understands money. He's made a lot of money on Wall Street. But unlike Yellen, he came into this office very blunt and very open about what a debt crisis we're in. And that in and of itself is very unique. Again, when I look at the difference, whether it's the Department of Justice, whether it's the National Security Association, whether it's National Intel, or whether it's the Secretary of the Treasury, the amount of candor. I'm not saying they're all Santa Clauses, they're all going to solve all the problems and everything's kumbaya, but the amount of candor and reality speak is so different than the last administration. Again, I'm a former Democrat, so this is not pro-Trumpism. I think there's a lot of Democrats who I've talked to can't deny that there was something asleep for the last 4 years in D.C. It was yawningly, dangerously bad. But again, that will upset half the audience. I get it. But Bessent understands that we need to cut down our debt to GDP. We need a weaker dollar. We need to reshore jobs. There is no easy solution. He recognizes that the BRICS are a threat. Trump recognizes that the BRICS are a threat. But they think that the U.S. is the biggest sucker. The BRICS countries would think they're the bigger sucker. There's a lot that I don't have the answers for and that Trump and Bessent don't have the answers for. The BRICS aren't going to go away and bow to tariffs, etc. So there are a lot of things that are not going to be clean and that Trump and Bessent can't solve. But what I do find refreshing about Bessent is he at least admits that we have a problem. It's like AA. You got to admit you're an alcoholic before you can get sober. And I've always used the analogy that our country and our central bank is just keep putting martinis on every problem, just keep getting drunk, keep adding the Bloody Marys, avoiding the hangover. At least someone is saying out of the Treasury Department that we've got a drinking problem with our debt. At least that's a start. How we move forward with the BRICS, with trade, with tariffs, believe me, I don't have the answers. I don't have all of them. I don't pretend to. And do I think we're going to have peace in the Ukraine? Trump said he'd do it in 24 hours. He hasn't. So I'm not saying Trump's going to solve every problem. And I'm not saying that anyone who doesn't believe in Trump is a fool or that everyone who does is a genius. I'm just saying we have to step beyond partisan politics and look at hard economics. And to your point about Bessent, at least he's admitting that we have a serious problem, that we can't grow unless we bring our debt to GDP down. Frankly, the only way I think we're going to grow out of this is to inflate away our debt, lie about inflation, and have negative real rates at a far deeper volume and go through a market mean reversion, which I think we're heading into. And by the way, a market mean reversion, 50, 40, 30% in the S&P, that's highly disinflationary. That takes away some of our inflation pain. It's a sick way of fighting the inflation problem. But a market crash would certainly do that. That's painful. A recession will certainly be disinflationary or deflationary. That solves our inflation problem. But
or
I think
helps
Trump is
with,
wrong.
not solves.
Well, yeah, exactly. It helps with. But I'm saying I think Trump, to say he was also going to, beat inflation and, do these tariffs and the war and reshore jobs. You can't have all of that at once. I think even Bessent knows that. But he's a politician. He had to get elected. But we can fight inflation through a deflationary recession, which is inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
And we can fight inflation through a market mean reversion, which this market. I'm not saying this current example of market volatility is a market mean reversion. We're getting closer. I'm far more bearish this year in 2025 on the S&P and the Dow and the Nasdaq than I was in 2024. I've been public about that. And I was with Henrik Zeberg and Francis Hunt recently in Cape Town. We're all very negative on the markets this year. And now we're seeing it. The VIX went from 19 last month to 27 today. Does this mean markets are going to tank straight forever? I don't know. But I'm saying this market's unsustainable. And in these markets that are so narrowly led by the Magnificent Seven, which are overvalued companies. We've seen that we bought $750 billion lost yesterday on Apple and Nvidia alone, one day trading. Does this mean that the markets are crashing? I don't know. 10% retracements are pretty normal in a market. We're not even there yet. But it's just I can't pick which needle is going to pop this red balloon of an S&P, Dow, Nasdaq bubble, but it's headed for mean reversion. That's Bob Farrell 101. Mm-hmm. Rather than try to time that, people should prepare for that. And the treasury market right now is quote unquote steady. The question is, as you've seen markets and equities tank, are you seeing a flow into U.S. treasuries? Not really. They're just holding steady. Yields haven't spiked. But remember, in 2020, during the COVID crisis, stocks and bonds in March fell together because they're both overvalued asset classes. Again, these are very, very scary times because the debt levels are so high, because the equity bubble is so high, because the credit bubble is so high, that any spike in interest rates or yields on the 10-year are going to accelerate any crashes in the S&P or the Nasdaq or the Dow. And you have to understand the correlation between rates and the stock market. And at some point, we probably will need capital controls, yield curve controls to keep those bond yields tighter. Because if they spike too fast, it's game over. It's game mm-hmm. over. And we'll be QE to the moon, which means the dollar gets weaker. And we'll see gold prices continue to go secularly north just because it's a better store of value. But if there's a flow to U.S. Treasury, the markets tank, you can see the DXY go up a little too. I mean, but these are just short-term gyrations. The end game, as Paul Tudor Jones, to me, is inflation. We can have a major deflationary moment. And Heinrich Zeberg said the same thing. And Hugh Henry and others have said the same thing. I agree. We can have a major deflationary moment, but the solution is going to have to be inflationary. We're going to have to print more money to buy our own debt because no one else will.
Yeah. Matt, I'd like to get your perspective on if you think gold is starting to enter, let's say, more of the mainstream zeitgeist. Bessent has mentioned it a couple times. I don't know if that's just Goldbug's picking up on the fact that he he said that gold is one of his biggest holdings, which has, I've seen reports that he turned out not to be the case anymore. Do you think that gold is entering more of the mainstream zeitgeist now?
Oh, definitely it is. When you're talking about revaluing gold or doing an audit on Fort Knox or the too big to fail banks, those are things that are making the headlines because politically Trump has been dropping these things in the media. Of course, it brings it to the headlines, which is both kind of charming and exasperating at the same time. There's a lot of misunderstanding. It's fascinating for me, who's been looking at gold for years, and for our company, that's been doing it for decades, to suddenly see all these gold experts popping up and saying, I told you so, when just 4 years ago, when gold was 1,600, they didn't care about it at all. But it always is ultimately good for people, whether they're very critical of gold or very positive about gold, to see it making more of a mainstream headline attention. Because look, gold doesn't go in a straight line, and certainly in the last 25 years has outperformed the S&P, et cetera, et cetera. But there are periods of years where gold did nothing and the S&P outperformed. But traditionally, when there's recessions, the outperformance of gold is pretty obvious. Not every time, but pretty obvious. And so just having that come up to the equation again, having that be discussed again, I think gold is intentionally ignored by the mainstream media. It's intentionally ignored by the too big to fail banks and the private wealth management teams, because gold is an absolute threat to the U.S. dollar. It's an absolute threat to the government. If the gold price rises too high, that means your fiat money is a joke. It's an open joke. And it's not in the government or the bank's best interest to see gold fully understood across the board. To me, that's very simple. But yet now, because of alternative media, because of political headlines, because of the Trump elephant in the room in the China shop breaking, gold's suddenly being discussed. For better or for worse, it's being discussed. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of nonsense, whether it's about Scott Bessent's holdings or how much gold Fort Knox really has or the banks really have. All that's kind of fog. But what it is bringing attention back to the fact that gold matters. This analog pet rock isn't just an outdated thing that's been money for millennia. It will continue to be money. It's fascinating. They'll talk about the importance of revaluing gold, which is, again, a guppy solution to a whale of a debt problem, or the auditing of Fort Knox, which isn't even where all the gold would be. It'd probably be in the basements of a lot of the New York banks. But you get past those headlines, it's amazing. Something like the COMEX, where you're seeing 21 billion of gold standing for delivery. This is not a gold reserve fund. The COMEX is a credit exchange. It wasn't supposed to stand for delivery. We're seeing record levels at 4 times the pace of last year of counterparties wanting their gold out of the COMEX. To me, that's the far more important story about gold. The stand for delivery, this open interest on the futures market on this New York exchange is hitting unbelievable levels of outflows. And that implication is not about price arbitrage between New York and London. It's not about tariffs with Trump. It's about counterparties want their physical gold. Why? They don't trust paper money anymore the way they used to. They don't trust the U.S. Treasury the way they used to. They don't want the U.S. dollar the way they used to. That is the real headline, and that's not making the front and foremost on the minds of most retail investors. For those who've been tracking gold for years and understand the price fixing on the COMEX, this is nothing new. But for me, that is the headline of the year. This outflow out of the COMEX is fascinating what its implications are, but it's all part of this broader narrative that the BIS told us in 2023 and the BRICS have been doing since 2022. The world sees gold as a better strategic reserve asset than the US 10-year or the dollar. That is not a gold bug case. That's history. And why do they prefer gold over these former sacred cows, these former tier one asset? Because those countries are too far in debt. And their credit is no longer as good as it used to be. And they're outstretched. And they're in that fourth stage of an empire where they're too spread out, too thin. And that's why Trump is trying to cut spending. And that's why Trump is talking about revaluing and auditing gold. But the real problem is it's too late. We're already in this crisis now. We have to make drastic changes. We need peace, not war. We need to cut our spending. We need to weaken the dollar. We need to bring our debt to GDP down. We need to reshore jobs. That should not be left versus right. That should be common sense to every American or Canadian or every citizen of the world in their own countries. But sadly, it's still hard for people to grasp that. And, yeah, to your question, it is nice to see gold finally reaching its head above the fog a little bit and being discussed. That doesn't mean gold goes in a straight line. It doesn't even mean that gold makes you rich. Gold just keeps you from getting poor because your fiat money, your Canadian, Australian, or American dollar, your euro, your Swiss franc, your yen, your ruble, more so in the West, is a beautiful ice cube that's just melting right before your eyes in purchasing power. You add on to that the invisible tax of inflation and then income tax. I'm surprised people can get through the day with all the things killing their wealth every day. So gold is just a protective preservation instrument. Yes, its price moves are incredible. I'm very happy for it. But I don't look at the price moves. I just know it holds its value better than fiat money. And the rest of the world does too. And since we weaponized the dollar in 2022, central banks have been buying gold at 3x the volumes they were pre that. There's a reason for that. Follow the hockey puck. This isn't a gold bug argument. This is history happening right now.
Well, Matt, this idea that, and you've kind of brought it up a couple of times, this idea of revaluing the gold that the U.S. holds currently on its books at $42.20 an ounce. Does that even make a dent in anything? Like what could they even really use that for?
Well, that's why I said it's a desperational measure. It's optics. But I mean, even if assuming we have 8,131 tons of gold, according to the World Gold Council in the last audit, whenever that was, if you revalued that from $42.22 per gold certificate mark to market, you're looking at 750 to 800 billion in instant QE gold liquidity. It's like QE with gold. But again, when you're at 37 trillion in public debt, it's a dent. It's barely a dent. It's what we spent on unlimited QE in 2020 in the first 8 months of unlimited QE. So I mean, it's our military budget for 1 year. Revaluing gold, marking it to market will not solve the problem. And as Kissinger, again, I have to bring Kissinger in. Other European countries tried to do this in the 70s. He was very against it. They wanted to maybe revalue U.S. gold then. He said, absolutely not. would kill Pax Americana. And what did he mean by that? If we revalue gold, and you think of the cliche, he who has the most gold wins, well, I got news for most viewers, if they don't know this already. The World Gold Council's audit of Chinese gold is probably off by 10x. And this is not a lone expression or a lone opinion. We know that gold is been carefully stacked in China for decades. They are thinking like chess players, while Americans think like checkers players. Even Trump admits this. And they've been doing the same with silver. They're stacking while we're going into debt and war. They're stacking precious metals. And if we revalue gold in the U.S. and China and Russia did the same thing, Russia produces twice as much gold as the U.S. Well, we're not going to be the leaders in gold. And so that will have massive ramifications on the dollar, massive ramifications on the gold price too. So as again, Kissinger said, be careful you ask for. If we publicly show what's under our kimono, it might not be so impressive. And so I think, that's interesting, but there's different ways to look at that. It'd be interesting for gold. But if Russia revalued its ruble and marked it to gold, that would be a devastating red button against the U.S. too. There's all kinds of things that can happen with gold. But as I've said in the military analogy, the reason Eastern central banks for years, since 2014, but certainly since 2022, when we sanctioned Russia and weaponized the dollar, the level of gold stacking is astronomical. And the gold coming off the COMEX this year is astronomical. That's not just a headline, folks. That's telling you something. That's showing you what the world is waiting for. Mm-hmm. They're basically building their financial ammunition before the border crossing, before the war. So in a financial scenario, what the Eastern central banks in Russia and China and the BRICS countries are doing, and what the counterparties in the COMEX are doing, is they see a financial war coming. They see disruption coming, and they've seen it for a long time. And they see how in debt the West is, how desperate the UK is, how desperate France and Germany are, how desperate and weak the US looks. And they're just playing the long game. They're not going to win and destroy America, but they're going to be more prepared. And at an investor level, you can do the same thing, stacking your gold. It's not kooky anymore. And it's fascinating. It's a tough time, but as I've said many times, it's almost sad to see gold become so center stage and so important to these banks, because it tells you how bad the rest of the world and how the rest of the things are. And that's not a gloating moment. As Rick Rule says, I'm afraid gold goes to 10,000. I'm not excited about it. Mm-hmm. Egon and I have talked about this year. Of course we want to see the gold price go up. We're heavily into gold, but the world around us isn't doing well when gold does well. So that's not something you can gloat about.
I totally agree, Matt. And when you were mentioning this idea of gold being delivered off the COMEX, there's obviously lots of speculation about why it's coming in so heavily mm-hmm. from the UK mm-hmm. or from mm-hmm. the LBMA. Do you have any ideas towards who is standing for that delivery? If it is, mm-hmm. refilling some of the speculations of saying it's refilling Fort Knox and the US's actual gold reserves. Yeah. I feel like if that was the case, I don't know that they would do it through that public of a channel.
Yeah, that would be like a great taking, like a bail-in. The U.S. is just bringing in gold from London markets and is going to confiscate it and steal it from the COMEX. I don't think it's that simple. The different bar sizes, ounce sizes. First, I don't know the exact answer, but my speculation mm-hmm. is, my guess is, and I don't know how much gold the U.S. has. No one really, I don't know. As I've joked before, if I were Trump or making headlines about doing an audit, I'd want to know before I did it publicly. I'd want to know.
Well, I went through and I did an interview last week with Jan Nieuwenhuis, and we went through this idea of the deep research he's done on the gold audits through the years mm-hmm. and the abnormalities, and he's submitted many FOIA requests and written mm-hmm. I think 8 or 9 articles about this and followed the story very closely, and all it does mm-hmm. is leave you with questions rather than any type of answer. So I mean, just that in and of itself, if you wanted to project power and confidence, a reasonable audit wouldn't be that much to ask. Right. Granted, it is going to be a lot of work, right? So I understand this tension between these two sides of the logistical reality of trying to audit and basically proof all of this gold and actually figure out what's there. But on the other side of it, it just leaves more questions in this current state.
Well, again, it goes to your guess point. If we had it, it shouldn't be so hard though to just do it and confirm it. And my guess is, and you're right, none of us really know. The cynical side of me, the realpolitik in me, and the person that's watched commodity trading for decades and looking at how the COMEX and the LBMA banks work, is a lot of that gold has probably been rehypothecated, leased out, and is gone. I don't know that for sure. But even if we had 8,000 or 10,000 or 12,000, even if we had more than the world gold, which I don't think we do, but I don't know, I'm not pretending to know. But even if we had more, it's still going to be one thing I'm fairly confident of. It's going to be a lot less than what China has, and probably a lot less than what Russia has. That's back to Kissinger's point. Don't go there yet. Now, are there law firms in New York who represent unnamed trusts that have been confiscating gold quietly off the books of Fort Knox? And who knows? It's like a Tom Clancy novel. I don't know. But to your question, I can't pretend to know. But what I can say is I don't think the U.S. has as much as other countries in the world do. And therefore, if we were to revalue gold publicly and show that, that could be very damaging. And I'm not quite sure why, unless Trump, and again, I'm speculating, unless Trump wants to show how little we have. That's a good way of weakening the dollar without having to blame himself. And he does need a weaker dollar, and we do need more inflation, and we do need an moment that isn't blamed on him. If it's not blamed on him, it's okay politically. Look, it's not my fault that they've been lying to us about how much gold we have. What we got now, we have a really weak dollar that helps inflate away debt. We're basically resorting to third world desperation. Even the Bitcoin strategic reserve is a third world desperate. That's the El Salvador model. Let's speculate on a speculation asset, take our lottery winnings and pay down our debt. Let's create a bubble and pay down our debt. Again, now the U.S. is talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. It's not even getting into the Bitcoin gold debate. That's a whole other movie. But just taking that in isolation, that's a desperate attempt. Like gold revaluation is a desperate attempt. But we have nothing but desperate options now, Tom. And Trump kind of knows it. And Besant knows it. Between the optics and the cutting of $2 trillion in the next 2 years at Doge, between a strategic Bitcoin reserve, between revaluing gold and auditing gold, these are all desperate ways to bring 500 billion in here, $1 trillion in here, 2 trillion in. We're trying to put our fingers in all kinds of holes in the dike right now. But again, all of that's too little, too late when we're looking at the trillions we're talking about here. And so we're going to have austerity. We're going to have an official recession. In my opinion, the middle class has been in one already for years. We're going to have to seek peace, not war, because a military solution in the nuclear age is not even an option. So there is going to be, as I said many times, the next 10 years aren't the end of the world. They're just going to be very, very different than the last 10 years. And if we want to reshore jobs and we want to bring productivity back into our countries and we want to bring gold back into our countries, all these things actually are good things. It's gonna be expensive and painful. And if we want to come up with ways, instead of fighting for natural resources, why don't we just pay for them? Why don't we just cooperate? That's better than going to war. And as Mearsheimer said, and it gets into foreign policy with Israel, why don't we stop worrying about doing other people's foreign policy and just pay for the things we want instead of making financial colonies or wars out of these places? There's a revolutionary thought, again. But change is messy, and those who are in power, ironically, it's more the liberals in power who won't give up their power and won't look at these things realistically, when traditionally they were the ones who were supposed to be for the people, for peace, for calm solutions, for the ganze Menge, the breite Masse, the masses. But the irony is now the masses are turning towards billionaires like Trump, not the familiar territory. Trudeau didn't capture the hearts and minds of his people. He had a pretty face, a nice haircut. He had the IQ of a low-level C- student in one of my college seminars. I wouldn't have taken him seriously at all. So again, we're not getting the best and brightest. We're not getting real leadership. And I'm not saying that Trump has all the answers or that the right has all the answers. I'm just not saying that. But we need to have far more discussions about viable, realistic austerity, pain, costs, and peace, as opposed to saber rattling among a broke Europe with a rising East and trying to pretend that's not happening. That's ridiculous.
I was part of a panel about Canadian politics the other day, and somebody brought up the idea that Canada was just bored of Stephen Harper and getting our financial house in order, and that's why we a lot of Canadians ended up voting for Trudeau, which I
Well,
thought
Harper wasn't as sexy as Trudeau, right? I mean,
Not at all.
he didn't look the part, and he was talking boring stuff like financial, sound money and balancing our books and being realistic about our debt. That's not sexy in the modern era of kind of the Twitter class and the Instagram class and the visual class, which you measured more by your necktie than you are by your IQ. The days of Truman or even Eisenhower, when they were going to war, we're going to go to war. We're going to do it by raising taxes. We're going to go to war in Korea. We've got to raise taxes, not expand our deficits. Eisenhower, clearly a patriot, clearly a brave soldier, wanted to cut the military industrial complex. That stuff wasn't sexy then. These were brave guys. They weren't Trudeau. They didn't look like tennis shoe models. They were actually real, I think, substantive individuals. And we've had a lot of less substance recently. And again, whatever you want to say about Biden, everyone now knows the open secret that he wasn't even there in the last 4 years, especially in the last 3 years. And the fact that his press secretary, his cabinet lied about that, I think that killed a lot of trust even in their own party. That was open and obvious. And that wasn't a partisan thing. That was an American problem. We should have been concerned. And the fact that we know we've been lied to about that has been, I think, irrevocably difficult for the Democrats to come back from. Yeah.
I certainly agree. Matt, I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up for today. Is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners to think about before we do?
Well, again, it's like I said, you can disagree with everything I've said here. Mm-hmm. I invite people, though, to look at Jeffrey Sachs, to actually listen to a speech by Putin translated, or read it, or listen to Mearsheimer, or listen to views that are totally different than your own. Mm-hmm. Go for it. And you don't have to agree with me, and you don't have to critique me, but try to be more informed and more self-critical and critical of your government without thinking that's anti-patriotic or a risk to your sanity. I'm not looking for followers. I'm looking for people to have an informed debate that's based on facts, not emotions. And I think we all would be better served by that in Canada, in Germany, in the U.S. And let's put on our big boy shoes and stop trying to just vote for the Red Sox or the Yankees and just enjoy baseball and try and enjoy the game. And I think a lot more lives will be saved and a lot more headache will be avoided if we start doing it that way. That's my final thought.
Yeah, that's one thing I've been speaking about recently, is trying to hold two competing ideas in your head at the same time, as difficult as that really can be, and trying to triangulate where we are in the world by listening to these different opinions.
Exactly, Tom. I think that's a great start.
Matt, always a pleasure, sir. Of course, all of my questions today were based on your recent articles, all available at Von Greyerz or Von Greyerz Gold, or vg.gold is the new website. And as well, I believe they post links to all of those as well on Twitter at Gold Switzerland.
Yeah, we're still at goldswitzerland.com or vongreyers.gold. Von Greyerz is a hard name to pronounce for some, so goldswitzerland.com is easy for others. But all our articles and interviews are posted there, and our thoughts are there. So I appreciate it.
Excellent. Matt, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, Tom.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.